other crime evidence to prove identity. There are some complicated issues involved in presenting other crime evidence to prove identity, so we will discuss this to prove identity issue in particular. To admit other crime evidence to prove identity, the law requires there must be these following conditions, following requirement. That is, there must be unique or distinctive feature or unique or distinctive methods of a crime. That is, when the defendant committed this crime, there must be this unique or distinctive feature in the methods of committing the crime, so that we can say this unique or distinctive way of committing the crime is the defendant's signature move. If we see someone who committed the crime in this fashion by using this method, we can say this crime most likely is committed by the defendant. That is the requirement. If we have, if this requirement can be satisfied, and then this other crime evidence can be admitted to prove identity. So once again, the requirement is there must be this unique or distinctive methods of a crime. We must satisfy this requirement before the court would permit admission of other crime evidence to prove identity. We have two cases in the chapter. The first one is Whitty versus State. In this case, the defendant was on trial for child molestation. And what happened was the defendant, the prosecution argued the defendant lured an 8-year-old girl to a basement by using a story of finding a black and a white rabbit. And defendant denied he committed this crime. He said he had this alibi defense. And then the evidence law issue in the case was this. The prosecution intended to ask a 10-year-old girl to testify that the defendant also lured her to a basement, attempting to commit this molestation with the same story of a black and a white finding a black and a white rabbit. So we know this another girl's testimony, this 10-year-old girl's testimony would be the evidence of a defendant's other crime. So the issue is whether this other crime should be admitted or not. The defendant argued this evidence is not admissible because he said prosecution cannot introduce other crime evidence to attack his character. But the prosecution argued this evidence was not introduced to attack the defendant's character, but was introduced to prove the identity of the perpetrator. So we need to examine whether in this case we had this unique or distinctive method in the way to commit the crime. So the ruling of the court in the case was there was this unique or distinctive feature of committing the crime, and this unique or distinctive feature of committing crime was this finding this black and white rabbit. We know we have many child molestators, and then but when they commit the crime, not necessarily all of them oh, it is not typical. Most of them would use this story of a black and a white rabbit as a way to lure this victim of their crime. So we know this story of finding black and white rabbit in this context should be considered a unique way of committing the crime. So in this case, the ruling of the court was this evidence was admissible because the prosecution indeed indicated or proved there was a unique or distinctive method in committing the crime. So that is a case to demonstrate what we mean by this, to use other crime evidence to prove identity and to use the evidence that way. There must be a unique or distinctive method in committing the crime, so that we can say that is really the defendant's signature move. So we see this kind of a way of committing crime, and then we can say most likely it was the defendant who committed the crime. It is very important that we understand this principle that is called the multiple admissibility rule. By this multiple admissibility rule, we mean once this other crime evidence is admitted for a permissible purpose, there is no way for the court to prevent the jury from using the evidence as character evidence. So in this, the case we discussed, and then the prosecution charged the defendant of this child molestation by getting an 8-year-old girl to a basement, attempting to commit this offense. And then in this contest, and then the prosecution would introduce another girl to testify that the defendant actually used the same method to lure her to a basement, attempting to commit this crime. So we know this evidence, the ruling of the court this evidence was admissible for the purpose of proving identity. But once this evidence was admitted, the court actually would instruct the jury. This evidence was introduced only for the purpose to prove the identity of the perpetrator. You should not use this evidence to come to the conclusion the defendant was a bad person, the defendant was a repeated offender. So for that reason, you should convict the defendant. The court would instruct the jury that way. You can only use the evidence to prove identity. You cannot use the evidence as a character evidence. But we know once this evidence was offered, once the jury actually learned about this evidence, there is no way for them to separate these two things. For them to separate these two things, that is, only to use the evidence as evidence to prove identity, but they would not use the evidence as character evidence. They would not think the defendant was a bad person. That was not possible. We understand once this evidence was in, and then there is no way for us to control how the jury would actually use this evidence. But even though that is the case, under this multiple admissibility rule, basically what we are saying is so long as this other crime evidence is admissible for a permissible purpose, even though this evidence could be used by the jury as character evidence, there is nothing we can do, and then we would still admit this evidence. So that is really what we mean by this multiple admissibility rule. But an important point we should also take note is this. In some cases, the prosecution may argue that other crime evidence is admissible for a permissible purpose, but its real intention is really to use this evidence as a character evidence, because we know once this other crime evidence is introduced as for a permissible purpose, and then there is no way we could control how the jury may use the evidence. So the prosecution would argue this evidence of this other crime evidence should be admissible to prove identity, but the calculation of the prosecution actually is the jury, after the jury hears this evidence, and then the jury most likely will use this evidence as a character evidence. If the jury would come to the conclusion the defendant is a bad person, and then that would make it easier for the prosecution to obtain this guilty verdict. So that is sometimes is the calculation of the prosecution. So in this kind of situation, it would be up to the court to make sure whether this other crime evidence that is offered indeed is for the purpose of proving identity. It is not for the purpose of using it as a character evidence. This issue, how this issue would play out, we will discuss it in the next case.